Well, good morning. Good Monday morning. It's not Monday, it's Tuesday. But it feels like Monday, doesn't it? On those long weekends, it's always difficult to really get a bearing on what day it is. I feel like on regular weeks I tend to lose days. So, but nonetheless, good morning. So I wanted to share a little bit this morning. I had a question come in about how do I define leadership, right? How do I define leadership personally? And that's um, it's a really broad topic. Right? There's a lot of things to get into, especially when it's really where your passion is, and you end up with all this uh, information, right, and experiences in your head, and so I really it took me some time to really think through this, and I think the best way for me anyway, when I think about leadership, I kind of break it into two different buckets. So one, I think about self, right? That if we're not able to lead ourselves first, then being responsible for leading anyone else, a people leader, is going to be really challenging, really difficult. I think about early on for me, 20 years ago, which is really what put me on this journey, is that I figured out relatively quickly I was a terrible leader, right? But I was a terrible leader because I was inexperienced, right? That was the reason why, at least at that time, that I just had not been introduced to really concepts of leadership. I understood how to manage fairly well, right? I mean, as well as any mid 20-year old could understand how to manage, but I just really didn't have a concept of leading people because I hadn't been exposed to that, right? I've been responsible for myself, but not responsible for anybody else in any capacity, really, at that time. And so I really recognized, or began quickly to recognize where those gaps were, and that they needed to be shored up. And I was just a really poor leader, to just transparently. But again, I'll use the excuse of inexperience, right? But because once you understand, and you have knowledge that there's gaps, then you know there's kind of an expectation or requirement to step into those if you're going to get better, right? And so I think about leadership kind of like I said in two buckets: the self, right? That if we aren't um, we don't have a decent understanding of ourselves, our own kind of motives and drives, and skill sets, and it's really difficult to then lead anybody else, right? Now, that's not to say that you get there and you plant a flag in the ground and say, "I am a leader," and you're done, right? It's to say that you know I've at least got enough understanding of myself to know what my triggers are, and know, kind of have a decent understanding at least of where you are today, what those values are, those things that drive you, the things that are really important to you. Um, and then from a secondary standpoint, like I say, it's responsibility leading people. So under the umbrella of self and leading self, I kind of break these up into three additional categories. So there's the skills, there's the traits, and then there's the beliefs, right? It's like, well, Dave, like, that's a lot. Okay, so what does that mean? Because again, anything that we leave undefined shouldn't matter, right? Undefined means irrelevant, right? So when I think about skills, you think about from let's say, a leadership perspective, or just from a life perspective, that when I'm leading myself, a skill, and this is where the planning and execution that we do with teams, with small business leaders, and with individuals and families becomes really easy, because when you break these things down like this, then they stop becoming some qualitative nebulous of thoughts and ideas, and they start. You can make them very qualitative and measurable in the sense that quantitative and measurable in the sense to say, hey, now I know where those gaps are. I can identify those, and then I can chase those, or I can make those targets and goals to close the gap on. And so, first is skill. Um, and an example of that would be communication. So I'd say, okay, in order to be an effective leader of myself, I probably need to communicate better, even to myself, right? That internal self dialogue. What does that sound like? And then what are those traits external of myself? So when I think about, again, from a leadership perspective, I think about the skill of communication. I think about traits, right, that show up under that. So what might those be? So a trait might be avoidance, right? So under communication, if I think about traits of that skill that I currently may have, right, as you're kind of thinking through things, that avoidance may be one of those traits, or passiveness may be one of those traits, or maybe even a passive aggressive, is that a word? If it's not, maybe it should be a passive aggressive approach to things, right? And so those are traits, right, that could be associated to how you communicate. And then when you think about the belief, so what does that mean? Well, this is really where the deep work begins, right? This is really where the work really starts to dig in, and this is where the real change starts to transpire. So the first two are really about kind of identifying the current, and then even maybe where you want to go. But then the beliefs are, well, if so, for an example, when you think about communication, you think about avoidance or passiveness, or even passive aggressiveness. Then beliefs could be that a belief of that could be it'll resolve itself, or that if I just leave these subtle hints that somebody will pick up on them and they'll understand what I'm trying to say, and they'll close that gap for me, or that maybe it's not my place, right, based on position or role or whatever that is, or maybe I don't know enough, and so I'll just stay passive, or I'll avoid this particular conversation, or maybe I don't feel valued, and in that case, then I'm definitely not going to speak up. So those are beliefs that could be associated with that pattern, right, of avoidance, or that those traits of avoidance or passiveness, under the skill of communication. And so then we just work to kind of shore up those beliefs, right, which then will change the traits, which then will shift the skill, or develop the skill. And so when I think about leadership from a self perspective, then that's really how I frame that up. And tomorrow I will tackle from the people perspective, and maybe hopefully drop some nuggets and add some value there. So thanks so much for being here today, for taking a look, for taking a listen. And please continue to send those messages in, continue to send those questions in. Um, I love sharing. It really sets me up for success for the day, from a mindset perspective, because I can feel like I get the day started by just adding a little bit of value and helping out a bit. So I love you. Thanks for being here. Have a great and productive short week. See you tomorrow. Take care.